We've covered quite a lot of ground in the 50 videos I've made on the subject of Photoshop for amateur photographers. Now, we don't need all of the techniques all of the time, of course, but here let's string those we do need together. Let's make a start by touching that Auto button, because we know Adobe Camera Raw will never set us wrong. A good place to start from, but the color balance looks a little bit cool to me, so I'm going to go to the dropper, pick an area I think should be white, and it does make a significant difference, and I'll enhance the vibrance just a little bit as well. One of my other favourites is the mid-tone contrast in clarity, but already I think I'm at the stage where I need to select that background, and to do that we need our masks. Click on the background, and with such a defined subject it shouldn't have too much difficulty in selecting that background. The problem is it's too light, so let's drop down the highlights and drop down the exposure. Now, as I tweak that, I can see a little bit of color balance that I'm not too keen on. So as you can see, I'm tweaking the tint and the temperature and then back to the other sliders just to get that background more or less where I want it. Going back to the masks, what I'd like to do now is to select a linear gradient, dragging it from the left, but of course it's going to affect the main subject. So using the subtract tool, I can subtract the subject. And there we have just the part we need to drop down in tone. Highlights and exposure should do that quite nicely. Now, of course, once I've done that, it does show up that section at the top right. So once again, if we go to a mask and a linear gradient, we should be able to click and drag over that corner, and we can darken that down so that the background nicely matches and we don't have any high spots to distract us. Now we turn to another mask, but this time I think I'll select the brush, because what I want to do here is to drop down the highlights and the exposure, and I just want to drop the flow so I can deal with those odd isolated areas that I can just see around the image. You can see one at the top to the right of the tiger, a little bit of lightness below the platform the tiger's laying on. These I quite like to use the brush. The other tools are great, but the brush is often very, very good. Now I'm going to select another mask, but this time I'm going to select the subject, because I'd like to do something with the colour, not significant, but I'd like to do a little work. A little increase in temperature, maybe a little increase in the tint towards magenta. I'm looking for that real nice glow from the tiger's body. Now once we've got to that stage, now I'm looking at the highlights here. And sometimes when we see these highlights, which are often made worse by the changes we've made, but they're not always as bad as they first look. And here I'm turning back to a brush, dropping the highlights, dropping the exposure, and just brushing into this area with a fairly small brush. And you can see that there is actually detail there to be retrieved. Sometimes it looks as though there's nothing there, but it certainly is. Now it's best to work very carefully here and to keep the flow rate of your brush down low so that these tools don't run away with you too fast. But then we can look around the image and see if there's any other areas that would benefit from the settings that we've just seen in this brush. This highlight seems to be a little bit outside of what I'm capable of bringing back, but as you can see, the one just below has come back just a little bit, but that upper one is obviously picking up just too much light, but it's a small area, not critical. But you can see what I mean. There's often other areas that we can deal with the same settings in the brush. And from time to time, it's not a bad thing if you can sit back and just evaluate what you've done. But now I want to deal with some of the highlights around the face. To do that, I'm using a brush, so I'm going to push up the highlights and the exposure. And I just want to lift them a little bit. I certainly don't want to lose any detail, but my intention here is just to draw the viewer into the face of the animal even more than we already were, just by raising the contrast in that area. And here I get the opportunity to match up that other ear as well. And once I've done what I think I need to do around the face, I will click around the image and look for any other areas which I think I could address using the same settings from that brush. But what I'd like to do next is to look at one or two more highlights, because once you deal with some, then the other ones tend to take their place. So once again, I'm going to use a brush. I do like to use these tools, they're more responsive in my view. So I want to take down the highlights a little bit, the exposure a little bit, keep the flow rate down, but I can now just take down any of the highlights that I think actually need just a little bit more attention. And I do appreciate that sometimes when I'm dealing with these things, they really are very small aspects of the image. But as I always say, image editing is a mass of small steps, but when you add them all up, they are significant. Now it's the eyes of the animal that's drawing my attention. So I'm going to get them quite large on the screen, and I'm going to turn to my brush once again. And we need to brush over both of the eyes, and we can do this gradually, but I need it just a little bit bigger, I think. But as we start to apply the mask, perhaps it's a good idea to step that up in the flow a little bit so we can apply the mask a little quicker. Once we've got both eyes done, then of course we can turn to the controls within the brush mask. I'll turn the mask off here because I want a little bit of exposure to put a real sparkle in those eyes. But because the animal is already a pretty colourful animal, maybe I'll just push up the warm tones of those eyes and even perhaps a little saturation if I can get away with it. Now I'd like to turn my attention to a radial mask where I can burn in the edges or darken the edges and the corners. We can double click on the image or click and drag. If the bounding box disappears, just touch the V key and it'll return. So I can adjust that shape to meet my demands, but then I'm going to invert it, so that now I've just got the outer edges and the corners selected, because I just want to darken them down a little bit. I don't want it to be too obvious, but it's a little tip to force the attention way into the center on the animal. Now I'm turning to another brush because I'm looking at one or two highlights that are still troubling me a little bit. So I'm going to drop the highlights and the exposure down. You can see the sort of areas I'm looking at here, making my brush the appropriates. Oh, I've got that flow rate far too high. Let's drop that back because it runs away with us a little too quickly if we've got that flow rate too high. But you can see the sorts of things that I'm looking to darken. They're again small areas that you may feel are not vitally important, but I am a stickler for attention to detail. So I'm going to keep going until I feel I've dealt with all of those highlights and they're not now a distraction. A few down the bottom, good thing to do the base a little bit darker because that tends to force our attention up into the main subject, and here that main subject is already pretty dramatic. Now here I've decided to go back to the basic editing screen and to pick up my healing brush, because there's one or two highlights in the background, little dots that you can see, which I think the image would be better off without. They're pretty easy to fix with a couple of clicks, and you can see the sorts of things that I'm doing. Just a little bit of painting over the area. Sometimes it's just a touch that will deal with them effectively. Sometimes a couple of sweeps with the brush, but we can deal with them pretty well and make sure that they're not distracting in any way. Looking around the image now to see if there's anything that I've missed, because there's always something. A little bit at the top there, maybe a little painting on that edge to take that away. Another touch just to make sure. Now I'm ready to go and look at the AI denoise. So back to the normal tab, down to the detail section and click the denoise. Once the panel appears, I'll select a position to see a before and after. And I'm clicking up by the ear of the animal where we can see some fine hair as well as the background. So we can see the noise as we click and release and what the AI is doing about it. It looks pretty good with the settings we have. So I think we can go ahead and click to enhance. With the denoise done, I'm going to open this up into Photoshop. It's opened up as a smart object, but I don't require that now, so I'm going to right click and rasterize the layer. Now zooming in on the platform that the tiger is lying on, I'm going to use my polygonal lasso tool to make a selection along that little distraction there, around the edge and back up, because I'm going to use AI generative fill. I need to reveal the contextual bar, if I can say it. Click into it and hit the enter key, and I'll speed up the process here. And as you can see, it does a good job. Let's have a look at the other version. I think I like the third one best, but I need to move along and do the area that's just to the right. Exactly the same thing using the polygonal lasso, clicking into the contextual bar. Need to rename that because I have trouble pronouncing it. But it does a remarkable job. And maybe even a couple of distractions at the end here, just to make sure that we're not going to be attracted to those, because they do show up even if they are small. Once again, exactly the same technique. Now switching to the layers tab, we can see all of those additions which we can then flatten into one image. What I'd like to do is to hit Ctrl+0, but then pick up my healing brush for one or two last little touches. Now there's a little speck on that board the tiger's sitting on, and also if you look really carefully there was a screw head there which is now gone. But there's a couple of little highlights which I'd like to deal with. So picking up the healing brush once again, there's a couple of highlights in the background that look like streaks. I'm going to try to do something with those. A couple of touches may be necessary, but you can see the sort of thing I'm looking to do. Any little touches around the image which I feel now is coming to its end. Just a couple of minutes time out is not a bad thing to do, but maybe finally just a little bit of burning. Selecting that burn tool, choosing mid-tones with a 10% exposure. So if I just wanted to touch one or two of those highlights, just to make the background lovely and subdued so the animal stands out perfectly in the glow of the sunlight. And there we have our image editing.